All right, so today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to do actually two little teachings, and we'll separate them out when we record them here. And the first one is going to be what I'm calling Purim Defended, defending Purim. And the reason why I want to do this is because obviously Purim is starting tonight into tomorrow and the next day. And this is something that is being attacked. You know, the celebration or the observance of Purim is being attacked quite a bit on the internet, as many things are attacked on the internet. As a matter of fact, anything that's being put forth on the internet is also being attacked on the internet. And so for every positive, there's an equal and opposite reaction, negative, it seems like, that gets put on the internet. So anything you're for, somebody else there is against. But I thought that it might be useful for us to address some of these issues. Now, so we have, issue number one is that we actually have something called our Bible or Scriptures, and this is our source material, our primary source material for our belief system. You did not come to believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Elohim of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You did not become a believer in Yeshua because you read it in the newspaper or because you read some sort of historical book. You got it from this thing we call the Scriptures. Okay, now this book is canonized with 66 books in it. And so we have to deal with that reality that this is our source. Now, is it true, which I will agree that it is true, is it true that the source material has issues? I would say yes, the source material does have issues. I do not believe that this is the perfect inerrant word of Yahweh as we understand it today. Was it perfect in its original? I am absolutely positive it was perfect in its original. We don't have any original, so I don't think that we have something that's perfect at this point. So when people are out there attacking, I will agree that yes, there are issues. Now, first thing that I want to address is that as we're looking at these issues, that we understand that it's a very slippery slope if we're going to start to say, well, the book of Esther doesn't belong in the Bible. We have other people that have said the book of Hebrews doesn't belong in the Bible. We've got other people saying that all of Paul's writings don't belong in the Bible. We've got people that say that, you know, in the canonization process, there were times when they thought that the book of James or Yaakov shouldn't be in the Bible or Revelation shouldn't be in the Bible. As a matter of fact, the canon, which we have today, before it was canonized, had changed its configuration hundreds of times over the years. And so there are lots of books that are in, that were out. There's lots of books that were in that are out now and they're not back in. So some were in and then out and then back in. Some were out and in, whatever. It's back and forth, back and forth. But we have to trust and believe in a creator. If you believe in your creator, then you believe that he gives us what we're supposed to have. And so since this is the source of knowing the Elohim of Abraham, you wouldn't even know about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob if it wasn't for this book. This is your source. This is your source of knowing everything you know about Yeshua. And so without this source, you have none of that. But this source goes all the way from Bereshit, from Genesis to Revelation. That's the source you have. And if we're going to start pulling things out, that becomes like pulling a thread out of a garment, and next thing you know, the whole thing unravels. And I can tell you, I've been down a similar journey to that in my life. And I've watched everything unravel. And I know what that looks like and what that feels like as I was on my journey for 7 years. And so I do want to first start off with, let's understand that when you watch people out there, and I'm not naming names because there's plenty of them out there, so nobody has to think that I'm picking on their particular video about Purim, or their writing, or their article, or their website, because I have seen many of them, and people have, because people contact us as a ministry and ask us, well, have you seen this, and have you watched this, and have you read this? And so I end up having to watch or read and see what they're talking about. Okay, so first and foremost, we must understand that dealing with the canon issue, or whether or not the book belongs in the Scriptures, is a dangerous and slippery slope. It's an argument that I would be very careful with. Okay? Now, let me explain the argument that they have. The argument that they have against the book of Esther is that, first and foremost, Yahweh's name does not appear anywhere in the book. This is true. It does not appear anywhere in the book. And actually, the Elohim, the word Elohim, I don't think appears in there either. Which, by the way, is one of the reasons why scribes who are training to be scribes, the first book that they actually do as a scribe is the book of Esther. Because that way, if they mess it up, they're not messing up anything that has the name of the Almighty in it. It doesn't have the tetragrammaton, the four letters, the Yud He Vav He. And so Yahweh's name does not appear in the book. Well, that's okay. That's interesting, but that's okay. One of the arguments I heard was that the Qumran scrolls, okay, everybody familiar with Qumran? Okay, where they discovered all of these scrolls in these caves in Qumran, and that they found fragments from almost every single book in the Bible except Esther of the Old Testament. Obviously, they didn't have anything of the New Testament, but the Old Testament. And so, of course, that's now very concerning, because why wasn't Esther in there? When I tell you why the reason is, you're going to be like, oh, of course. Why were these scrolls in a cave in Qumran? The answer is because there was no, let me backtrack. What do you do to dispose of something that has the name of Yahweh in it? Can you just throw it in the garbage? Do you just, dispose of it any which way you want? See, the traditions going down through time was that you couldn't do those things if the name was in them, so you put them into jars and you buried them, or you stuck them in a cave. And so these were documents in Qumran that either had scribal errors, so the scribes needed to discard of them, or they had become tattered and damaged and no longer being used, and so rather than burn them or throw them in quote-unquote a garbage, they would put them in jars and bury them. So interestingly enough, the book of Esther wasn't found because it doesn't have the name. So why would you expect it to be in the place you put things that have the name? You could get rid of the book of Esther as a scroll any way you wanted to. Does that make any sense to everyone? You see? So these are those arguments. Now again, you have to be aware. You can hear arguments on the internet, and if you don't have a background that is diverse enough and vast enough, you could easily listen to an argument and say, wow, I didn't know that. Man, this is no good. I need to throw it out. You could be convinced more easily than someone who has a more extensive background. Which is why, again, as always, I encourage you that you need to have a covering. Because you need to have someone who has a background, who can understand the context. And when someone says, well, there wasn't any books of Esther fragments found in Qumran. And I'm like, well, I would never expect there to be. Because it doesn't meet the criteria of anything that you would find in a jar in a cave. Because we have to understand why they're in there in the first place. See, this goes back to what I've talked about over and over and over, which is context. You have to have the context. And what is the context? The context is what's happening, why is it happening, who's doing it, where is it happening, those kind of things. Well, this is where scrolls were kept in jars in a cave, and the first thing you should ask is why? Why were they in it? So you might think, well, they were there because there was a library and they were kept for safekeeping. No, actually, those are the ones that were being junked. Those are the discards that were in the jars. And that's because you couldn't just dispose of these things in any other way. They may have also put some in there to safekeep when they were going to be in trouble, when people were coming to give them some grief. But mostly, this is a tradition that's long-standing in Judaism, that you take and bury scrolls that have the name. You don't burn them. You don't throw them in a garbage pail. They have to be discarded by burying them. And so we have to be careful about this slippery slope. And so we deal with the Qumran issue, and I'm going to just mark it off my list here. So why there are no fragments there. Now, we talked about Yahweh's name not appearing in the book. We also need to include in this discussion that there's an argument about the pagan origins of the names like Esther, and it's about Ishtar, and now we're back to Easter again, and Mordechai is a worshiper of Marduk, and somehow this is a rewriting of the story of Artemis, and all of these things. Okay, let's deal with some of this stuff. So the name of Yahweh is not in the book of Esther, but let's understand that we may not have had the whole story of understanding her name and why things are that way. There is a verse, let's go to Deuteronomy 31 and in verse 18. Deuteronomy 31 and verse 18. And here it says, and I shall certainly hide my face in that day because of all the evil which they have done, for they shall turn to other mighty ones. Now, the key that I want to put here is the idea of hiding my face. He says, I shall hide my face. Do you know that the word there for hide is astir? Aleph, Samech, Tav, Yud, Resh. Look it up in your interlinear. It's astir. If you go to Ezekiel 39 and verse 29, Ezekiel 39:29. We have the same word appearing again. He says, and no longer do I hide my face. Because remember we just read where he says, I will hide my face. Now he says, and no longer will I hide my face from them, for I shall have poured out my spirit on the house of Israel. Again, this idea of hiding his face uses the word astir. Astir. So we see that the book of Astir, or Esther, there's things that are hidden. So rather than have Yahweh's name be overt, or Elohim referred to directly, everything in the book of Esther is hidden. There's tremendous amounts of things that are in there that are hidden. And so the Jewish community, if you go to their teachers, will tell you that this is one of the most valuable books of instruction in walking upright because it's the book of things that are hidden. There's tremendous sod level things in the book of Esther or Astir. So could her name really have been more about being hidden? And by the way, we also have to understand her name was not Esther, her name was Hadassah. Her name was Hadassah, but in going into meet with the king, she was told to use the name Astir, hidden. Because she was hidden among them. Remember, she didn't admit to being a Jew. She didn't say anything. And so she was hidden among them for such a time as would be needed, such a time as this, as they say, so that she could stand up and show the courage. The courage that had been hidden in her that maybe had not been seen. And so this is really important, that we understand that this astir. And so we have some verses. By the way, we also have that this is called the Megillat, the Megillah, the Megillat Astir. Megillah, which means scroll, but the word Megillah also comes from the root word galia, which means revelation. So now you have the revelation of what is hidden, is the book or the scroll of Esther. The revelation of that which is hidden. See, there's so many things that, of course, the people that are attacking don't address. They don't know. They don't know how to deal with. So wouldn't that make things a little different in your perspective to understand the interesting uniqueness of the book of Esther? The scroll of Esther, the Megillat Esther, has incredibly important things, the revealing of that which is hidden. By the way, one of the things that's revealed that was hidden was the significance of Saul, remember Saul HaMelech, King Saul, not killing all the Amalekites. He let go the king Agag, and we have Haman, a descendant of Agag, an Agagite, as the nemesis in the book of Esther. Haman, the Agagite, as the symbol of those that would want to destroy Yah's people. And so we can now see the connection, because, you know, how many of you have maybe read, and not really made these connections earlier, but how many have read the book of, or the instructions were talked about where Saul was given the instruction to kill all, and wondered, why did he need to kill everybody? Why was this such a big deal? Well, guess what? We see it playing out in the book of Esther. So that which was hidden, in other words, we didn't understand it, is now being revealed. We see a revealing of why killing all the Amalekites was important. And by the way, I promise you some of the problems we have today are because of the Amalekites. There are still Amalekites harassing and threatening Israel. And so the endorsement of that understanding comes through a lot through the book of Esther. So we see that as well. Interesting. So it's very interesting. So we continue through some of these things that people are saying about this book called Esther and the celebration called Purim. One of the things that they will talk about is that Esther and Purim are not mentioned in any other book. Okay, so nobody else quotes anything from Esther. But you know what? You want to show me all the verses where it says that the creator of the universe is going to send his son and he's going to die for us in an overt way? No, we know we have hidden things. And that's the idea of that which is Esther, or hidden. And that in the Brit Hadashah is then revealed, Galia. But are there any verses that point to? This is an argument by all the anti-missionaries. Where are the verses in the Tanakh that specifically and clearly and openly talk about Yeshua? There aren't any. They're all hinted at and hidden. So if you're going to use your book and understand your book and accept what it does and doesn't say and its limitations, then you're already accepting that you believe in that which is hinted at and hidden. And so we don't see everything that's in the Tanakh mentioned, by the way, in the Brit Hadashah. You don't see specific references to kashrut being kept or instructed. You don't actually see any specific references to tell you to keep Shabbat, because people will say, where's the Shabbat commandment? Because not murdering is mentioned, not committing adultery is mentioned. There are some things that are mentioned. Why are some things not mentioned? Well, because not everything got mentioned by other people. The book of Esther is there to reveal things that were already playing out, that already were instructed, that were already taught about life in captivity, about being able to stand up at the risk of death. There's all kinds of lessons in the book of Esther that are the same lessons you, by the way, see in other places. But it's not a prophecy like you get from Daniel or Ezekiel or Jeremiah. It's not one of those type of books. So it doesn't get referenced. So does this prove anything? No, it doesn't prove anything that nobody specifically quotes directly from the book of Esther. And by the way, if I went through all of the quotes that everybody made, I bet you I could find some anyway. I've never made the effort, but I'm sure I could. Some of the people out there are making the argument that Esther is about revenge. The book of Esther is about revenge. And that revenge is not a thing of Yahweh. I don't see that. The book of Esther is about revenge only from the point of view of Haman wanting to take revenge as an Amalekite. I don't see anything about the Jews doing any revenge. Now, it does say that they were given weapons so that they could defend themselves, but it wasn't to take vengeance. So I don't see this as a vengeance book. Did any of you ever read the book of Esther as a vengeance book from the Israelite or Jewish point of view? You can see the vengeance, though, from Haman's point of view. He wanted vengeance. This is his generational angst. By the way, and that's what you see even today. Well, I shouldn't say today. Go back a little while to when the wall started coming down on the Iron Curtain. And as soon as the Soviet Union fell apart, what did you see? All of those countries where they had imposed authority, and that authority now left, all fell right back, even though it had been 40, 50, or 60 years or more, all fell back to their hatred generationally of the other peoples. You see this with the Serbs and the Croatians, and you see this with some of the other generational fighting, because there was no longer a force to damp that down. Well, do you think that, because people don't forget, generationally they don't forget. That's what you see playing through with Haman. By the way, you see this with Hitler. The Germans had not forgotten what had been done to them, quote unquote, and how they were treated after World War I. Because of all of the restrictions and the things that were imposed on them to keep them from being a threat again, they had not forgotten that. And so you see that's a big part of what happened to cause World War II from World War I. People don't forget things that are done to them and their people. They don't let go very easily. And so this goes on and on. Look, you see this throughout the dark ages of Christianity, where they called all the Jews Christ killers. You see? It's this constant need to attack. Yet this is not the Jews doing any revenging. Okay, so I don't see that anywhere in this argument whatsoever. So we'll cross that one off the list here. We covered that. There are those that will talk about that there have been changes or additions made to the modern or newer versions of the book than there were in the older ones. Did we not start off this discussion by saying we've all seen that in all of the books? Can we all agree that modern versions of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Deuteronomy, Exodus, and Leviticus, any of them are slightly different than the older versions because of people thinking they're helping by tweaking things to the way they understand things now? Can we all agree that Esther is not the only book you can see this in? You can see it in every single book of Scripture. But they'll use that argument to say that, well, they're adding and taking away, and we're not supposed to add and take away. Well, no. All of your translations have done adjustments to the best of their understanding and translating to the different language that you speak now. Unless you want to read it in the Hebrew or the Greek, you need to have it translated. And when you translate, you have to make choices in how you translate. And those who are doing the translating may think they're helping by doing what they do to bring, quote unquote, better clarification or ease of understanding. That is why your NIV is missing verses, has added verses, and all kinds of mess. And I'm not talking about the book of Esther. I'm talking about everywhere. And so I think that that's a challenge to say that just because there are some changes or additions to this book of the book of Esther, that causes us some sort of a problem. And so we have to be careful with that, the historical. Now, there's another thing that they talk about, historical inaccuracies. Anybody ever see any articles written or any YouTubes done where people claim that the Bible is no good because it doesn't match the archaeological record, and then you find 57 other videos that say it matches perfectly? People use archaeology to disprove and to prove. Or they find something new that changes the argument after they just had the argument a different way. We all know what that's like. It's like on the health scale, right? Everybody says, this is no good for you, don't eat it. Then they find out later, no, actually it is good for you. You can eat it, but don't eat this other thing. And that changes every 5 minutes. So if you wait long enough, whatever it is you like, eventually they'll say it's good for you. And eventually they'll say it's bad for you, and then eventually they'll say it's good for you. Because, for example, all of the attacks on all fats, they're now realizing is a big contributor to Alzheimer's. And so you don't want to get rid of all of the fats because that affects the nerves in the brain, which need those fats. Cholesterol is a brain chemical. So you get rid of all your cholesterol, now what do you got? You got Alzheimer's. And that's why we need to have a readjustment and understanding of what's good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. Look, this is a metaphor for what we're talking about scripturally. You have the same thing in your scriptures. Histories, they'll say, oh, they've discovered something that shows that this is wrong. And then they'll find out that oh, no, we found another thing that says it was right. And it goes back and forth and back and forth. So we got to be careful with this historical accuracy thing. It's just like the argument that somehow this is a retelling of the story of Artemis. Okay, we could say, this is a retelling of the story of Artemis. You know what? There are books out there that make the argument that Yeshua is the retelling of every God being, whatever, every savior that any culture's ever had. I've seen those books. And they'll show that some of them had 12 disciples, and some of them, said they were the Lamb of God. And you can find Yeshua's whole story in a lot of other places. So you're going to throw him out now too? In other words, be careful how you use the arguments because those arguments need to be used universally. You can't just use them on one place and say, I'm not going to use it someplace else. If it's a valid argument, it's a valid argument. Use it everywhere or don't use it. Is that fair? Okay? Use it everywhere or don't use it. But if it's not a valid argument otherwise. So we have to be careful. We have to be careful. Let me just see what else I've got on the list here. I've got one or two more things. Okay, some of these places are using two things to discredit Purim. Well, actually, we'll even start earlier than that. We go back to the adding and taking away thing. They'll say that it's not a Leviticus 23 observance. Okay, so now we're adding feasts. Wait, hold on a second. Let's go to the book of Esther. Okay, and in the book of Esther it says, and let's understand what it says here very clearly. Now remember, Yahweh's name is nowhere in this book, so it can't be anybody claiming it's Yahweh's feast. His name isn't in the book anywhere. So we're looking in chapter 29, and it says in verse 17, it said that was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day of the month of Adar, they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. So they have 2 days. for this feasting and gladness. The Jews who were in Shushan assembled on the 13th as well as on the 14th, and on the 15th day of the month they rested and made it a day of resting and fasting. Okay, so they have these things going on. And then it says in verse 26, therefore they called the days Purim after the name Pur. By the way, do you remember, now this may be a little bit of a stretch, but didn't they cast lots for Yeshua's garments? See, there's a hidden, hinted thing about Pur. Pur is the casting of lots. Purim is lots in plural. Okay, because they cast lots. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter and what they had said concerning this matter and what they had come upon them, the Jews, listen now, established and imposed it on themselves. It's a national celebration that they imposed on themselves. They didn't claim it was for anybody else. They didn't claim that it was of Yahweh. But they also said, and upon their seed and all who would join them, all that would graft and join them as a national observance. Oh, no, we're adding and taking away. It's not in Leviticus 23. Hold on a second. Hold on. Go to Zechariah 8. Let's go to Zechariah chapter 8. Because I'm telling you, you're going to see these out there in these attacks. Oh, it's not in Leviticus 23. It's not a feast of Yah. I agree. It's not a feast of Yah. That doesn't make it wrong, okay? Just like there's nothing wrong with celebrating a national holiday as an American or a Canadian or whatever country you live in. There are national holidays. But look in chapter 8 and in verse 19. It said, thus said Yahweh of hosts, the fast of the 4th and the fast of the 5th and the fast of the 7th month and the fast of the 10th month are to be joy and gladness and pleasant appointed times for the house of Yehuda, and they shall love the truth and peace. Yahweh is endorsing, let's see, he's got the 4th, the 5th, the 7th, and the 10th. That's 4 fasts, only one is in Leviticus 23. The other 3 are imposed by Judah like Purim. Okay, I'm not going to go look them up for you, but you know the fast of the 7th month is Yom Kippur. Okay? The other fasts, believe it or not, have a lot to do with the destruction of the temple and the siege of Jerusalem, and they had commanded fasts for these things. And I'm not going to go through that right now with you, but I can at a future point. But these are not Levitical 23 fasts. Matter of fact, you won't find these fasts commanded by Yahweh anywhere, but here's Yahweh saying, those fasts shall be joy. He didn't say those fasts are wrong, how dare you. He doesn't have a problem with that. But yet you'll see there are people out there that say that having Purim as an added celebration. Now, they'll say, well, so why do people come out of Christianity and out of the church and then they leave, Easter and all that other stuff behind, and now they're going to jump into this other ditch with Purim? No. Purim is not the same thing. Purim is in a book. You see it commanded and instructed in chapter 8 or 9 when we were reading that verse. Okay, in the book of Esther, you see the instruction, but then they'll say, okay, they're going to now use demonstrations and video and other things to show you how people today in the Jewish community are celebrating Purim as a reason to discard it. Now, let me say this. Because somebody's doing something stupid with something that Yahweh said, doesn't make Yahweh wrong. Or something that the Jews said, or something that is in the Scriptures. Just because they're doing it stupidly doesn't make it wrong. That's important that we get that. Because you will see people, they'll show footage of Purim in Tel Aviv. You know what you're going to see in Tel Aviv? You're going to see all of the alphabet soup, LGBT, all that other stuff, doing all kinds of cross-dressing, strange dressing, Mardi Gras on steroids. But you're going to find that in Tel Aviv all year long. That doesn't mean that because they do Purim that way, that means that's what's expected of everybody else. You've all heard me tell you this is not, Jewish Halloween. There's nowhere in the book of Esther to tell you to go ahead and dress up in all kinds of costumes. And so just because people are doing this foolishly, look, it's just like Hanukkah, where they've turned Hanukkah into Jewish Christmas, where they give presents every day. That doesn't change the fact that Hanukkah is a legitimate observance, that we see Yeshua on Solomon's porch during the Feast of Dedication. We see these things, however, because people are doing it foolishly, it doesn't, do you understand what I'm trying to say here? Are we making sense? Because they'll do that. They'll use these things to show how people do things today. Well, there's a lot of things people do today. There's a lot of things that, by the way, Messianic Torah observant believers do today. There are some that are still running out there putting blood on their doorposts. That's against Scripture. But they're doing this to observe Passover. There are people that are observing Passover and all your other feasts in very bizarre ways. There are people observing the Sabbath in very bizarre ways. That doesn't mean that in some way that ruins or taints the legitimacy of things like the feasts or Sabbath, just because some people are doing them in dumb ways. We should understand that. They'll also use Talmudic references that talk about how to celebrate Purim, because that's in some of their written writings. Again, just because others later on in history decided to, because remember, Purim happened about 350-something, okay, BCE, before Yeshua. And so just because we have that going on doesn't mean that now, by the time the Talmud is written, it's almost, let's see, from 300 before to like 300 or 400 after. It's almost 1,000 years later, okay? That somehow these people are now telling us that that has anything to do with the book of Esther. It's the way they've decided to do it. Were they influenced by their time in Babylon? Were they influenced by other things? Absolutely. You're still influenced by what you went through in your life. We talked about that as part of our CC 101 class. You're influenced by how you were raised and where you lived and who you lived with and what you experienced. And if you were in leadership and had to make decisions and write it down, you would do similar things as well. And so we can't say just because there are some writings in the Talmud that somehow that has anything to do with the book of Esther being right or wrong. It may have something to do with the Talmud being right or wrong, but it doesn't have anything to do with whether the book of Esther is right or wrong, or Purim is right or wrong, just because somebody wrote some things that may not make any sense. So this is really, really important that hopefully we're getting to and I'm going to end with that. I just want us to appreciate that in Purim, okay, Purim, the observance that was instructed, it's first of all not mandated by the heavenly host. Okay, Yahweh, Yeshua, nobody mandated you to keep Purim. The Jews imposed it on themselves. That is actually in the verses, and their seed and anyone that would join them, and said this is something to remember and commemorate this tremendously dangerous event where they almost basically got wiped out. Oh, and by the way, they'll say, oh, well, the Assyrians and the Babylonians and these other peoples, they kept such tremendous records, and there's no record of this event happening in their writings. Well, you know what? Who writes the writings? The victor writes the writings. Who wins writes the writings. And so you when you're the winner, you're going to write anything about a big loss later on, or you maybe going to purge that out, burn it, throw it out, whatever you're going to do. It's not going to end up in a scroll in a jar anywhere. They weren't concerned about those things. So just because they have not found any historical evidence doesn't mean that it's not there. They're finding things every day, all the time. So we have to be very careful about what level of confidence do we need to have to claim or say that something that's in your scriptures doesn't belong there or is not legitimate. Hopefully that's making some sense. And with that, I will say to you, Chag Purim. Happy Purim. You can say it back. Chag Purim. Okay? Because now understand that now you should be on a journey to figure out what's being revealed and what was hidden in the book of Esther. Because astir means to hide. And so, I mean, it's almost the exact sound and pronunciation as Esther, astir. Oh, no, Esther is Astarte, and it's Easter, and it's not. Really? It can't be this? It can't be astir? It can't be hidden? Why can't it be? Especially when it's much more congruent to what we understand scripturally. And so I hope that we end up getting the Galia, the revelation, that Purim might actually be useful and valid and should not be attacked. Amen? Amen.